The gold band caught the afternoon light as Sarah Mitchell pressed it into the palm of Doc Henderson's calloused hand, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely complete the gesture. She stood in the cramped back room of Henderson's General Store in Dodge City, Kansas, where the physician kept his medicines locked away behind the counter, and the smell of camphor and dried herbs hung thick in the air like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. It was late August of 1878, and the heat outside made the wooden buildings shimmer like they might melt into the dusty streets at any moment. But Sarah felt cold all the way through to her bones because her younger brother Timothy lay dying of fever back in their small rented room above the seamstress shop, and this ring was the only thing of value she had left in the entire world. Doc Henderson held the ring up to the light, streaming through the grimy window, squinting at it with his one good eye, while the other stayed permanently shut from some old injury he never talked about. The ring was simple but beautiful, a thin band of gold with a small sapphire set into it. The blue stone no bigger than a kernel of corn, but precious beyond measure because it had belonged to Sarah's mother, who had died 3 years ago from consumption, leaving Sarah at 18 years old to care for Timothy, who had only been 11 at the time. Their father had died even earlier, trampled by cattle during a drive up from Texas when Sarah was just 15, and there had been no other family to take them in, no aunts or uncles or grandparents who could have shouldered the burden of 2 orphan children. "This is worth more than the medicine," Doc Henderson said slowly, turning the ring over in his weathered fingers. He was a man in his 60s with white hair that stood up in wild tufts around his head, and a face that had seen too much suffering to be entirely comfortable profiting from it. "Your mother's ring, is it not?" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak, because if she opened her mouth, she knew a sob would come out instead of words. She had already cried so much over the past 3 days, as Timothy's fever climbed higher and higher, his small body burning up, while he thrashed in the narrow bed and called out for their mother in his delirium. Sarah had tried everything she could think of, bathing him in cool water, forcing weak broth between his cracked lips, praying until her knees ached from kneeling on the rough wooden floor, but nothing had worked, and she knew with a terrible certainty that if she did not get the quinine the doctor said he needed, Timothy would be dead before the week was out. "I need the medicine," Sarah finally managed to say, her voice coming out hoarse and strained. "Please, Doc Henderson. He is all I have left." The old physician's face softened with something that might have been pity, or might have been respect for her desperation, and he nodded slowly. "I will give you the quinine, but I want you to know I am not comfortable taking this ring. It should stay in your family." "My family will not exist if Timothy dies," Sarah said, and the finality in her voice seemed to settle the matter. Doc Henderson moved to the locked cabinet where he kept his most valuable medicines, the ones that cost money to import from back east and could not be easily replaced in a rough cattle town like Dodge City. He unlocked it with a key he kept on a chain around his neck and pulled out a small brown bottle filled with white powder. "Mix a teaspoon of this in water 3 times a day," he instructed, his voice taking on the professional tone he used when dispensing medical advice. "The fever should break within 2 days if we caught it in time. If it has not broken by the 3rd day, come back to me immediately." Sarah took the bottle with both hands, cradling it against her chest like it was made of the most fragile glass in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she turned to leave before the tears could start falling again, because she needed to get back to Timothy as quickly as possible. She pushed through the door that led from the back room into the main area of the general store, where other customers browsed the shelves, stocked with everything from canned goods to rope to ready-made clothes shipped in from Kansas City. The store was relatively crowded for a Tuesday afternoon, with ranch wives examining fabric and cowboys stocking up on supplies before heading back out to their spreads. Sarah kept her head down as she wove through the people, not wanting anyone to see the tears that were now streaming down her face despite her best efforts to hold them back. She had almost made it to the front door when she collided with someone, her shoulder hitting solid muscle with enough force to make her stumble backward. Strong hands caught her by the arms, steadying her before she could fall, and she looked up into the face of a man she had never seen before in her life. He was tall, probably close to 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of someone who spent his days doing hard physical labor under the brutal prairie sun. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble, a straight nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, and eyes that were the color of whiskey in lamplight, a warm amber brown that seemed to look right through her. He wore typical cowboy attire, dusty boots, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a black hat that he had pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster well-oiled and obviously frequently used, though something about the way he carried himself suggested he was not the type to draw, unless absolutely necessary. "Easy there," he said, his voice a low rumble that had a hint of Texas drawl in it. "You all right, miss?" Sarah pulled away from his grip, suddenly aware that she was crying in front of a complete stranger and clutching a bottle of medicine like her life depended on it, which in a way it did. "I am fine," she said quickly, wiping at her face with her free hand. "I apologize for running into you." The cowboy's amber eyes moved from her tear-stained face to the bottle in her hands, and something shifted in his expression, a kind of understanding or concern that made him look at her more closely. "Someone sick?" he asked, and the question was gentle enough that it did not feel like an intrusion. "My brother," Sarah heard herself say, even though she had not intended to share anything with this stranger. There was just something about his steady gaze that made her want to unburden herself, to tell someone about the fear that had been eating away at her for days. "He has a terrible fever. The doctor says this medicine should help." The cowboy nodded slowly, his expression grave. "Fever is serious business out here. I hope your brother recovers quickly." "Thank you," Sarah said, and she meant it. She started to move past him toward the door, but then she heard Doc Henderson's voice calling out from the back of the store. "Mr. Thornton, I have those supplies you ordered ready for you." The cowboy turned his head toward the voice, and Sarah took the opportunity to slip out the door and into the late afternoon heat. The sun was still high enough to make the main street of Dodge City almost unbearably bright, the light reflecting off the windows of the buildings and the dust that hung perpetually in the air. Sarah hurried along the wooden sidewalk, passing the Long Branch Saloon, where she could hear the tinny sound of a piano and men's laughter, the sheriff's office with its sturdy door and barred windows, the hotel where traveling cattlemen stayed when they came to town with their herds. She climbed the narrow stairs at the side of the seamstress shop, her legs feeling weak beneath her, and pushed open the door to the two-room space she and Timothy rented for $12 a month. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a shelf that held their meager collection of dishes and food supplies. The second room was barely large enough for the bed Timothy and Sarah shared, a trunk that held their clothes, and a washstand with a chipped basin. Timothy lay in the bed exactly where she had left him, his small body curled on its side, his face flushed red with fever. He was 14 now, but the illness had made him look younger, more vulnerable, and Sarah felt her heart clench with fear as she sat down beside him and placed a hand on his forehead. He was burning up, his skin dry and hot to the touch, and when she said his name, he barely stirred. Sarah got up and went to the kitchen area, her hands shaking as she pumped water into a cup and carefully measured out a teaspoon of the white powder from the bottle. She stirred it until the powder dissolved, then went back to Timothy and gently lifted his head. "Timothy," she said softly, "you need to drink this. It will help with the fever." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with illness. "Sarah," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Yes, it is me. Drink this, please." She held the cup to his lips and tipped it slowly, letting the liquid trickle into his mouth. He swallowed reflexively, coughing a little, but he got most of it down before his eyes closed again, and he sank back into the fevered sleep that had claimed him for the past 2 days. Sarah sat with him for a long time, holding his hand and praying that the medicine would work, that she had not given up her mother's ring for nothing. The ring had been the last tangible connection she had to her mother, the only thing she could touch and know that her mother had touched it too, had worn it every day of her married life until the consumption took her. Sarah could still remember her mother lying in bed at the end, so thin and pale she barely looked human anymore, and how she had pulled the ring from her finger with trembling hands and pressed it into Sarah's palm. "This was my mother's before it was mine," she had whispered, her voice rough and broken from coughing. "Now it is yours. Keep it safe, and think of me when you wear it." But Sarah had not been able to wear it, had been too afraid of losing it or damaging it while she worked her various jobs around town, cleaning houses and taking in mending, and occasionally helping out at the restaurant during busy times. Instead, she had kept it wrapped in a handkerchief in the trunk, taking it out only late at night when Timothy was asleep, and she could slip it on her finger and pretend for a few moments that her mother was still alive, that she was not completely alone in the world except for one sick little brother. Now the ring was gone, traded for a bottle of white powder that might or might not save Timothy's life, and Sarah felt the loss of it like a physical wound. But she would make the same choice again without hesitation because Timothy was all she had left, and she would give up anything, everything, to keep him alive. The light outside gradually faded as evening came on, and Sarah lit the oil lamp on the small table beside the bed, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She gave Timothy water when he would take it, bathed his face with a damp cloth, and waited for some sign that the medicine was working. By the time full darkness had fallen and the sounds from the saloons and dance halls below had reached their nightly crescendo, Timothy's fever seemed no better and no worse than it had been before, and Sarah tried to take comfort in the fact that at least it had not gotten any higher. She must have dozed off sitting in the chair beside the bed, because she woke with a start to the sound of knocking on the door. For a moment she was disoriented, not sure what time it was or what day, but then she saw that the lamp had burned low, and the noise from the street had quieted somewhat, suggesting it was late, probably past midnight. The knocking came again, soft but insistent, and Sarah got up stiffly and went to the door. "Who is there?" she called out, not opening it because a woman alone did not open her door to strangers in the middle of the night, not in a town like Dodge City where violence and vice were as common as dust. "My name is Cole Thornton," a man's voice answered, and Sarah recognized it immediately as belonging to the cowboy she had run into at the general store. "I met you this afternoon at Henderson's place. I have something for you." Sarah hesitated, her hand on the door latch. Everything she had been taught about propriety told her not to open the door, but curiosity and something else, some instinct she could not quite name, made her pull it open anyway. Cole Thornton stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands, looking somewhat uncomfortable but determined. In the dim light from her lamp, she could see that he was holding something small, and when he opened his palm, she saw her mother's ring glinting there. "I do not understand," Sarah said, staring at the ring and then up at his face. "How did you get that?" "I bought it from Doc Henderson," Cole said simply. "He told me you traded it for medicine for your brother, and I figured a family heirloom like that should not end up in a pawn shop somewhere, so I bought it and brought it back to you." He held out the ring, his expression earnest. "It is yours." Sarah felt like all the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She looked at the ring, then at Cole's face, then back at the ring, trying to make sense of what was happening. "But I cannot pay you for it," she said, her voice coming out in a whisper. "I have no money. That is why I had to trade the ring in the first place." "I am not asking you to pay me," Cole said, and he sounded almost offended by the suggestion. "I am giving it back to you, no strings attached." "Why would you do that?" Sarah asked, because in her experience people did not simply give things away, especially not to strangers, especially not valuable things like gold rings. There was always a price, always some expectation of payment or favor. Cole was quiet for a moment, and in the silence Sarah could hear Timothy stirring restlessly in the other room, murmuring something incoherent in his fever. When Cole spoke again, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "My mother died when I was about your brother's age. She left me a pocket watch that had belonged to her father, and it was the only thing I had to remember her by. A few years later, I was desperate for money, and I pawned it. By the time I went back to get it out, the pawn shop owner had sold it, and I never saw it again." He looked down at the ring in his palm. "I have regretted that for the past 10 years, and when Doc Henderson told me about your situation, I figured I could stop the same thing from happening to someone else." Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of despair, but of overwhelming gratitude and disbelief that a complete stranger would do something so kind for her. She reached out with a shaking hand and took the ring from his palm, closing her fingers around it tightly. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt wholly inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done. "Thank you so much. You do not know what this means to me." "I think I do," Cole said quietly, and there was a sadness in his eyes that suggested he understood loss and regret better than most people. He put his hat back on and touched the brim in a respectful gesture. "I hope your brother gets well soon, miss." "Sarah," she said impulsively. "My name is Sarah Mitchell." "Miss Mitchell," Cole amended with a small smile. "I will let you get back to nursing your brother. Good night." He turned to go, and Sarah stood in the doorway watching him walk away, still clutching the ring in her hand, like she was afraid it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Just before he reached the stairs, she called out, "Mr. Thornton." He turned back, one hand on the railing. "Yes, ma'am? If there is ever anything I can do to repay you, please let me know." Cole shook his head. "No repayment necessary. Just take care of that brother of yours." Then he was gone, his boots echoing on the wooden stairs as he descended to the street below. Sarah closed the door and leaned against it, looking down at the ring in her hand. In the lamplight, it seemed to glow with its own internal warmth, the sapphire catching the light in tiny sparks of blue fire. She slipped it onto her finger, feeling the familiar weight of it, and said a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought Cole Thornton into her life at exactly the moment when she needed him most. She went back to Timothy and gave him his second dose of medicine, mixing the powder in water and coaxing him to swallow it, even though he barely woke enough to register what was happening. Then she settled back into the chair beside the bed, too keyed up to sleep, her mind racing with questions about the strange cowboy who had given her back her mother's ring without asking for anything in return. The rest of that night passed slowly, each hour marked by the distant sound of the church bell and the gradual quieting of the town, as even the most dedicated drinkers and gamblers finally made their way home, or to their hotel rooms. Sarah dozed fitfully in the chair, waking every time Timothy stirred or coughed, checking his fever with her hand and giving him water when he would take it. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside the window, Sarah noticed something that made her sit up straight in her chair, her heart suddenly pounding with hope. Timothy's skin, when she touched his forehead, felt cooler than it had at any point in the past 3 days. Not completely normal yet, but definitely cooler. And when she pressed her lips to his temple the way their mother used to do when they were sick, she could tell that the fever was breaking. "Timothy," she said softly, leaning closer to him. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened, and this time they were clear and focused instead of glassy with delirium. "Sarah," he said, his voice weak but coherent. "What happened? I feel terrible." Sarah laughed, the sound coming out half like a sob, and she took his hand and squeezed it gently. "You have been very sick with fever, but the medicine is working. You are going to be all right." Relief washed over her in a wave so powerful it left her shaking, and she had to put her head down on the edge of the bed for a moment to collect herself. Timothy was going to live. The medicine had worked. She had not lost him. Over the next 2 days, Timothy continued to improve, his fever dropping steadily until it was gone completely. And he was able to sit up in bed and take solid food, though he was still weak and tired easily. Sarah continued to give him the medicine exactly as Doc Henderson had instructed, and she spent her time between doses catching up on the mending work she had neglected, while Timothy was at his sickest, her needle flying through fabric as she repaired torn shirts and replaced buttons and took in waistbands. On the 3rd day after Cole Thornton had returned her ring, Sarah was hanging laundry on the line, strung across the small balcony outside their rooms, when she heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see Cole himself climbing toward her. He was dressed much the same as he had been the first time she saw him, though his clothes looked cleaner and his jaw was freshly shaved. When he reached the top of the stairs and saw her standing there with a wet sheet in her hands, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to check on your brother and see how he is faring." Sarah felt a smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile she had managed in what felt like weeks. "He is much better, thank you. The fever broke the morning after you returned my ring. He is weak still, but the doctor says he will make a full recovery." The relief on Cole's face was unmistakable, and Sarah realized with a small shock that he had genuinely been worried about Timothy, this boy he had never met, simply because he cared about what happened to her. "That is wonderful news," Cole said. "I am very glad to hear it." "Would you like to come in?" Sarah asked, making a quick decision that propriety could go hang itself, because this man had done something extraordinary for her, and the least she could do was offer him a cup of coffee. "I have coffee on the stove, and I think Timothy would like to meet the man who saved his life." Cole looked surprised by the invitation, but he nodded and followed her inside. Timothy was sitting up in bed, propped against the pillows, reading from the one book they owned, a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that had belonged to their father. He looked up when they entered, his eyes curious. "Timothy, this is Mr. Cole Thornton," Sarah said, going to the stove to pour coffee into 2 tin cups. "He is the one who made it possible for us to get your medicine." Timothy's eyes widened. "You are the one Sarah told me about? The one who bought back her ring?" Cole shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone would do," he said, which Sarah thought was a generous assessment of human nature, given how many people in town had known about their situation and done nothing to help. "You saved my life," Timothy said, with the blunt honesty of youth. "Sarah would not have been able to get the medicine without trading the ring, and you made sure she got to keep it. That was really kind of you, sir." "Well," Cole said, clearly at a loss for how to respond to such direct gratitude. He took the cup of coffee Sarah offered him and took a sip, buying himself a moment to think. "I am just glad you are feeling better, young man. You gave your sister quite a scare." "I know," Timothy said soberly. "I do not remember much about being sick, but I remember Sarah crying, and that scared me worse than the fever did." Sarah felt her cheeks flush and busied herself with straightening things that did not need to be straightened. Cole caught her eye over the rim of his coffee cup and gave her a look that was both sympathetic and slightly amused, like he understood exactly how embarrassing it was to have a younger sibling share such personal details with a stranger. "So, what brings you to Dodge City, Mr. Thornton?" Sarah asked, partly to change the subject, and partly because she realized she knew almost nothing about this man who had inserted himself into their lives in such a dramatic fashion. "Are you passing through with a cattle drive?" Cole shook his head. "I was working on a ranch about 30 miles south of here, but the owner sold his herd and let most of his hands go. I came to town to collect my final pay and see about finding new work. I heard there might be positions available on some of the spreads north of here, so I was planning to head that direction in the next day or two." "You are leaving?" The words came out before Sarah could stop them, and she heard the disappointment in her own voice. Cole heard it too. She could tell by the way his expression shifted, becoming more intent, more focused on her face. "I need to find work," he said slowly. "I have a little money saved, but not enough to last more than a few weeks without a job. But I do not have to leave immediately." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "If there was a reason to stay in Dodge City for a while longer, I could probably find something temporary here in town." Sarah felt her heart beat faster in her chest. She knew she should not ask him to stay, knew that it was improper and forward, and that people would talk if they saw her spending time with a cowboy she barely knew. But she also knew that she wanted to see him again, that something about Cole Thornton drew her in a way she had not experienced with any of the other men who had tried to court her over the years, the awkward ranch hands and shop clerks who had stammered their way through invitations to church socials or town dances. "I would like to thank you properly for what you did," Sarah heard herself say. "Perhaps you would allow me to cook you dinner. It is not much, but it is the least I can do." Timothy grinned from his position in the bed, clearly delighted by this development, and Sarah shot him a warning look that did nothing to dim his enthusiasm. Cole's face broke into a smile that transformed his whole appearance, making him look younger and more carefree. "I would like that very much, Miss Mitchell. When would be convenient for you?" "Tomorrow evening," Sarah suggested. "Around 6 o'clock. "I will be here," Cole promised. He drained the last of his coffee and set the cup down on the table. "Thank you for the coffee and for the invitation. It has been a long time since I have had a proper home-cooked meal." After he left, Timothy immediately started peppering Sarah with questions about Cole, wanting to know if she thought he was handsome, if she liked him, if he was going to come courting. Sarah deflected as best she could, while her mind raced ahead to the next evening, mentally going through their meager food supplies and trying to figure out what she could possibly cook that would be impressive enough to serve to a man who had done something so monumentally kind for them. The next day, Sarah went to the market early and spent more money than she probably should have on ingredients, buying a chicken, potatoes, carrots, onions, flour for biscuits, and even a small jar of honey as a treat. She spent the afternoon cooking, grateful that Timothy was well enough now that she did not have to constantly hover over him. And by the time 6 o'clock rolled around, the small room smelled amazing, and the table was set with their best dishes, which admittedly were not very impressive, but at least were not chipped or cracked. Cole arrived exactly on time, knocking softly on the door. When Sarah opened it, she saw that he had made an effort to dress nicely, wearing a clean white shirt and a string tie, his hair still damp from washing. He held his hat in one hand and a small wrapped package in the other. "I brought something for dessert," he said, offering her the package. "I stopped by the bakery and got some apple pie. I hope that is all right." "That is very kind of you," Sarah said, taking the package and feeling touched that he had thought to bring something. She stepped aside to let him in, very aware of how small and cramped their living space was, how shabby everything must look to him. But Cole did not seem to notice or care about any of that. He greeted Timothy, who was sitting at the table looking much healthier than he had a few days ago, and then sat down in the chair Sarah indicated. The meal was simple, but good, and the conversation flowed easily in a way that surprised Sarah. Cole told them stories about his life as a cowboy, describing cattle drives and roundups, wild horses and wilder weather, the camaraderie of working alongside other ranch hands, and the loneliness of night watches under stars so bright and numerous they looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. He had been born in Texas, he told them, the son of a farmer who had lost his land during the financial troubles after the Civil War. His father had died when Cole was 16, and his mother had followed less than a year later, leaving Cole to make his own way in the world. "I tried farming for a while," he said, accepting a second helping of chicken from Sarah. "But I did not have the temperament for it, or the money to buy good land. So I hired on with a cattle drive heading north, and discovered I had a knack for working with livestock. I have been cowboying ever since, moving from ranch to ranch, going wherever the work takes me." "That sounds like a lonely life," Sarah observed, cutting into her own chicken. "Never staying in one place long enough to put down roots." Cole considered this, his amber eyes thoughtful. "It can be lonely sometimes," he admitted, "but it has its compensations. I have seen things and been places most people only read about in books. The first time you see the Rocky Mountains rising up out of the plains, or watch thousands of buffalo moving across the grassland like a living river, that stays with you." He paused, then added more quietly, "But you are right that it is not the kind of life that allows for much in the way of permanent connections. Most cowboys I know do not have families because they are always moving on to the next job, the next ranch, the next town." "Do you want a family someday?" Timothy asked with the directness of youth, and Sarah nearly choked on her water. "Timothy!" she said sharply, but Cole just laughed and did not seem offended by the question. "I think I would like that," he said, looking at Timothy. But Sarah had the feeling he was really answering for her benefit. "If I found the right person, and if I could figure out a way to make it work with the kind of life I lead. But that is a big if." After dinner, they had the apple pie, which was delicious, and then Timothy excused himself to bed, claiming he was tired, though Sarah suspected he was really just trying to give her and Cole some time alone. Once he had closed the door to the bedroom, Sarah and Cole moved to the two chairs by the window, where the evening breeze brought some relief from the day's heat, and they could look out at the darkening street below. "Thank you again for dinner," Cole said. "That was the best meal I have had in months, maybe years." "I am glad you enjoyed it," Sarah said, pleased by the compliment. "And thank you again for what you did with the ring. I still cannot quite believe you did that for us." Cole was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the street where people were beginning to emerge for the evening, heading to the saloons and dance halls for entertainment. "Can I ask you something personal?" he finally said. "Of course. How did you and Timothy end up here, alone in Dodge City? You said your mother passed away, but surely there must be other families somewhere." Sarah shook her head. "Our father died when I was 15 and Timothy was 12. He was killed during a cattle drive, trampled when there was a stampede. Our mother did her best to provide for us after that, but she was already sick with consumption, and it just got worse over time. She died 3 years ago, and there was no other family to take us in. My father's people were all dead, and my mother was estranged from her family back east, something to do with them disapproving of her marriage. So, it was just Timothy and me." "That must have been incredibly hard," Cole said quietly. "You were so young to have that kind of responsibility." "I did what I had to do," Sarah said simply. "Timothy is my brother, and I love him. I would do anything to keep him safe and healthy." She twisted the ring on her finger, feeling the familiar weight of it. "This ring was all I had left of my mother, but I would have given it up permanently if that was what it took to save Timothy's life. Material things do not matter as much as people." "No," Cole agreed. "They do not." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and admiring and a little sad all at once. "You are a remarkable woman, Sarah Mitchell." No one had ever called her remarkable before, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am just doing what any sister would do." "I do not think that is true," Cole said. "A lot of people would have given up, or sent Timothy to an orphanage, or married the first man who offered just to have someone to share the burden. But you have kept going, taking care of him yourself, making a life for both of you. That takes strength and courage. Sarah did not know what to say to that, so she just looked down at her hands and tried to get her emotions under control. After a moment, Cole reached over and gently took one of her hands in his touch warm and calloused and surprisingly gentle. "I know we just met," he said, "but I would like to spend more time with you, if you would allow it. I know my circumstances are not ideal, that I am just a drifting cowboy with no permanent prospects, but I have not been able to stop thinking about you since that day in the general store." Sarah looked up at him, her heart beating so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "I have been thinking about you too," she admitted, "and I would like to spend more time with you as well." Cole's face broke into that transformative smile again, and he squeezed her hand gently before letting it go. "Then I will stay in Dodge City for a while longer. I saw there were some temporary positions available at the stockyards, loading cattle onto train cars. It is hard work, but it pays decent and it would allow me to stay in town." "You would do that?" Sarah asked, surprised, and touched that he would alter his plans for her. "I would," Cole said firmly. "In fact, I already did. I went to the stockyards this morning and they hired me on the spot. I start tomorrow." They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging from serious topics to lighter ones, sharing stories about their childhoods and their hopes for the future. Sarah found herself opening up to Cole in a way she had never done with anyone else, telling him things she had barely admitted to herself, like how scared she had been after their mother died, how sometimes she felt like she was drowning under the weight of responsibility, how she longed for someone to lean on instead of always having to be the strong one. Cole listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just letting her talk. And when she finally wound down, he told her some of his own fears and regrets, like how he sometimes wondered if he had wasted his life drifting from place to place instead of building something permanent, how he missed his parents even after all these years, how he worried that he was getting too old to keep doing the hard physical labor that cowboying required. By the time Cole finally left, promising to come back the next evening after his shift at the stockyards, Sarah felt like she knew him better than she knew most people she had been acquainted with for years. There was something about him that made her feel safe and understood, like she could be her true self without fear of judgment or rejection. Over the next few weeks, Cole became a regular presence in their lives. He would come by every evening after work, often bringing small treats for Timothy, a stick of peppermint candy or an interesting rock he had found, things that delighted the boy and made Sarah's heart swell with affection. Timothy adored Cole, following him around when he had the energy, asking endless questions about cattle and horses and life on the range. Cole was patient with him, treating him with the kind of easy affection that suggested he genuinely liked children, and Sarah could see that Timothy was starving for male attention, for someone to fill even a small part of the void their father's death had left. But it was the time Cole spent with Sarah that really mattered, the evenings they sat together, talking after Timothy had gone to bed, the Sunday afternoon walks they took through town and out along the river, always with Timothy trailing behind as an impromptu chaperone to preserve Sarah's reputation. Cole told her more about his life, and she told him more about hers, and gradually they built up a foundation of shared confidences and mutual understanding that felt like it could support something real and lasting. Sarah found herself falling in love with him, a process that was both exhilarating and terrifying, because she had never felt this way about anyone before, and she had no idea if he felt the same way about her. She studied his face when he was not looking, memorizing the curve of his jaw, and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the small scar above his left eyebrow that he said came from being kicked by a horse when he was learning to ride. She noticed the way he moved, economical and graceful despite his size, and the way he was always aware of his surroundings, a necessary skill for someone who had spent years working with unpredictable animals and living in rough camps where danger could come from any direction. One evening about a month after they had met, Cole arrived at their door looking more serious than usual. Sarah let him in, immediately concerned that something was wrong. Timothy was at a neighbor's place, playing with their son, who was close to his age, so Sarah and Cole were alone for once. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked as Cole took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had learned meant he was nervous or troubled about something. "Everything is fine," Cole assured her, but he still looked uneasy. "I just need to talk to you about something important. Sarah's stomach clenched with anxiety. "What is it?" Cole took a deep breath and then said in a rush, "I am in love with you, Sarah. I know we have not known each other very long, and I know I do not have much to offer you, but I cannot keep this to myself anymore. I love you, and I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Sarah stared at him, her mind momentarily blank with shock and joy. Then she started to laugh, partly from relief and partly from sheer happiness, and Cole looked confused and a little hurt until she crossed the small room and took his hands in hers. "I love you too," she said, looking up into his amber eyes and seeing them widen with disbelief and then joy. "I have been in love with you for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything because I did not know if you felt the same way." Cole let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it for a very long time, and then he pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. Sarah could hear his heart pounding, feel the solid warmth of him, and she wrapped her arms around his waist and held on tight, feeling like she had finally found the place where she belonged. "I want to marry you," Cole said into her hair. "I want to take care of you and Timothy, to give you both the kind of security and stability you deserve. I know I am just a cowboy without much money or prospects, but I am a hard worker, and I will do whatever it takes to provide for you." "I do not care about money or prospects," Sarah said, pulling back just enough to look at his face. "I care about you, about the kind of man you are. You are good and kind and generous, and you make me feel safe and loved. That is worth more than all the money in the world." Cole cupped her face in his hands, his callous thumbs gently stroking her cheeks, and then he leaned down and kissed her. It was Sarah's first real kiss, and it was everything she had hoped it would be, tender and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Sarah felt like her whole body was glowing. "Is that a yes?" Cole asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You will marry me?" "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town, with Timothy as their only attendant and a few of the people Sarah had worked for over the years in attendance. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself from pale blue fabric, the color that Cole said matched her eyes, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Timothy had picked for her that morning. Cole wore his best clothes and looked so handsome Sarah could barely breathe when she saw him waiting for her at the front of the church. The ceremony was short and simple, but when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Cole kissed her in front of everyone, Sarah felt like the luckiest woman in the world. They had a small celebration afterward at the restaurant where Sarah sometimes worked, with cake and lemonade and good wishes from the handful of guests. Timothy was ecstatic to have Cole officially as part of their family, and he spent the whole afternoon grinning like someone had given him the best present imaginable. Cole had used most of his savings to rent a small house on the outskirts of town, a 2-bedroom structure with a kitchen, a sitting room, and even a small barn out back. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean and sturdy, and it was theirs, with enough space for all of them to live comfortably. Cole had already moved their belongings from the rooms above the seamstress shop, and when he carried Sarah over the threshold that evening, while Timothy cheered, she looked around at their new home and felt tears of happiness prickling at her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornton," Cole said, setting her down gently and kissing her forehead. "Mrs. Thornton," Sarah repeated, testing out the name. "I like the sound of that." That night, after Timothy had gone to bed in his own room, excited to finally have his own space, Cole and Sarah lay together in their bedroom, wrapped in each other's arms. Cole was gentle and patient with her, knowing this was her first time, and he made sure she felt loved and cherished every moment. Afterward, they lay talking in the darkness, making plans for their future, discussing everything from what kind of chickens they should get for the yard to how many children they wanted to have someday. "I want to give you everything," Cole said, running his fingers through her long hair that she had let down from its usual bun. "A good home, a secure life, children, everything you have ever wanted." "You already have," Sarah said, snuggling closer to him. "You gave me love and partnership and a family. That is all I ever really wanted." Cole shifted so he could look down at her face in the moonlight coming through the window. "I still cannot quite believe you said yes," he admitted. "That someone like you would want to marry someone like me." "Someone like you?" Sarah echoed, reaching up to touch his face. "You mean someone who is kind and brave and selfless? Someone who bought back a stranger's ring because he understood what it meant to lose something precious? Someone who stayed in a town he had no reason to stay in just because he wanted to get to know me better? Cole Thornton, you are the best man I have ever known, and I am the lucky one that you chose me. Cole kissed her again, deep and thorough, and they spent the rest of the night learning each other, mapping the landscape of their new life together. The next few months were some of the happiest of Sarah's life. Cole continued to work at the stockyards, while Sarah took in mending and occasionally helped out at the restaurant. And between the two of them, they made enough money to live comfortably with a little left over to save. Timothy thrived in their new home, growing stronger and healthier now that he had good food and a stable environment, and he started going to school regularly, something he had not been able to do consistently when they were living above the seamstress shop and money was so tight. Cole was everything Sarah could have hoped for in a husband. He was affectionate without being overbearing, treating her as an equal partner in their marriage rather than as property or a servant. He consulted her on decisions, asked her opinion on things, and genuinely seemed to value what she had to say. He was patient with Timothy, helping him with his schoolwork and teaching him practical skills like how to care for the chickens they had bought and how to fix things around the house when they broke. In the evenings, they would sit together on the small porch Cole had built onto the front of the house, watching the sun set over the prairie and talking about their day. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to visit, and Sarah was surprised and touched to find that being married to Cole had somehow made her more accepted in the community. Like, his presence gave her a respectability she had not had as a single woman struggling to raise her brother alone. About 6 months after their wedding, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was sure, and when she finally told Cole one evening after Timothy had gone to bed, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face lit up with joy, and he swept her into his arms, holding her carefully like she was made of glass. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, even though his reaction made it obvious that he was. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Cole said, kneeling down and pressing his ear against her still flat stomach, like he might be able to hear the baby already. "I am going to be a father. You are going to be a mother. We are going to be a family." "We already are a family," Sarah pointed out, running her fingers through his hair. "Timothy is part of this too." "You are right," Cole said, looking up at her with those amber eyes she loved so much. "We are already a family, and now we are growing. That is even better." When they told Timothy the next morning, he was initially confused and then excited when he realized he was going to be an uncle. "Can I teach the baby things?" he asked eagerly, "like how to read and how to catch frogs and all the important stuff." "You can definitely teach the baby things," Sarah assured him, amused by his priorities. "But you will have to wait a while because babies are very small and helpless at first." "How long is a while?" Timothy wanted to know. "About 7 more months," Sarah told him, and watched his face fall at the idea of such a long wait. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, Cole became even more attentive and protective, insisting that she not work too hard and taking over most of the heavier household chores himself. Sarah found it both touching and occasionally frustrating because she was pregnant, not made of porcelain, but she tried to be patient with him because she knew his protectiveness came from a place of love. By the time winter arrived, Sarah was visibly pregnant, her belly round under her dresses, and she had to stop taking in as much mending work because sitting for long periods made her back ache. Cole picked up extra shifts at the stockyards to compensate for the lost income, and Sarah worried about him working such long hours in the cold, but he insisted he was fine and that providing for his growing family was his responsibility and his joy. The baby was born on a cold February night in 1879, with the wind howling outside and snow piling up against the windows. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Sarah thought she might not survive it, but Cole stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand and encouraging her. And finally, just as dawn was breaking, their son came into the world with a lusty cry that proclaimed his arrival to anyone within earshot. Cole cut the cord with shaking hands while the midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, and when she placed him in Sarah's arms, Sarah looked down at his tiny red face and felt a love so overwhelming it made everything she had thought she felt before seem pale in comparison. "He is perfect," she whispered, counting his tiny fingers and toes to make sure they were all there. "He is beautiful," Cole agreed, sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping his arm around Sarah's shoulders so they could both look at their son together. What should we name him? They had discussed names endlessly over the past months, but had never quite settled on one they both loved. Now, looking at her son's face, Sarah suddenly knew. "What about James?" she suggested. "That was my father's name." Cole's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "James Thornton," he said, testing out how it sounded. "I love it. James Thornton it is." Timothy, who had been banished to his room during the birth, was finally allowed to come in and meet his nephew. He approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide with wonder, and when Sarah carefully shifted the baby so Timothy could see him better, Timothy reached out one finger and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. James immediately wrapped his even tinier fingers around Timothy's finger, holding on with surprising strength, and Timothy's face broke into the biggest smile Sarah had seen from him in years. "He likes me," Timothy said with awe and delight. "Of course he likes you," Sarah said, feeling exhausted and happy and more content than she had ever been in her life. "You are his uncle. You are going to be very important to him." The months after James's birth were exhausting in a different way than anything Sarah had experienced before. The baby needed feeding every few hours, day and night, and there were times when Sarah felt so tired she could barely stand. But Cole was there every step of the way, getting up with her in the middle of the night, walking the floor with James when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, doing whatever he could to help. Timothy was also surprisingly helpful, entertaining James when he was awake and fetching things for Sarah when she was too tired to get up. The three of them, 4 now with James, settled into a routine that felt comfortable and right. And Sarah realized that this was what she had been longing for all those years when she and Timothy were alone, this sense of being part of a complete family. As James grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby who recognized his parents and brother and lit up whenever he saw them, Sarah watched Cole with their son and fell even more deeply in love with her husband. Cole was a natural father, patient and playful, and James clearly adored him, always reaching for him when he came home from work, gurgling happily when Cole tossed him gently in the air or made silly faces to make him laugh. One evening when James was about 8 months old, Sarah was washing dishes after dinner while Cole played with the baby on the floor, and Timothy did his homework at the table. She looked at the three of them, her family, and felt such a surge of gratitude and happiness that she had to pause and just take it all in. This was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had dreamed of during those dark days when Timothy was sick, and she thought she might lose him, when she was alone and scared and did not know how she was going to keep going. And it had all started because Cole Thornton had seen her crying in a general store and decided to do something about it, because he had bought back her mother's ring and given it back to her without asking for anything in return. That single act of kindness had changed the entire trajectory of her life, had given her love and partnership and a family of her own. She looked down at the ring on her finger, still there after all this time, and touched it gently. Her mother would have loved Cole, Sarah thought. She would have been so happy to know that her daughter had found someone who treated her with such respect and affection, who had taken on the responsibility of caring for Timothy without hesitation, who was such a devoted father to his son. "What are you thinking about?" Cole asked, looking up from where he was helping James stack wooden blocks, only to have the baby knock them down with a delighted squeal. "I was thinking about how lucky I am," Sarah said honestly. "How different my life could have been if you had not walked into Henderson's store that day." Cole's expression grew serious, and he carefully set James down with his blocks and came over to where Sarah stood. He took the dishcloth from her hands and set it aside, then pulled her into his arms, not caring that her hands were still wet and soapy. "I am the lucky one," he said firmly. "I was drifting through life with no purpose, no direction, moving from one temporary job to another with nothing to show for it at the end. Then I saw you in that store, looking so desperate and so determined, and something in me just knew that you were important, that I could not let you walk out of my life without at least trying to help. Buying back that ring was the best decision I ever made because it led me to you, and you gave me everything I did not even know I was missing: a home, a family, a reason to build something permanent instead of always moving on. You saved me just as much as I like to think I helped you." Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were good tears. Happy tears. She reached up and kissed Cole, tasting the salt of her own tears on her lips, and he kissed her back with all the love and passion that still burned between them, as strong as it had been in the beginning. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I love you too," he whispered back, "more than I can ever adequately express." From the floor, James made a protesting noise, apparently unhappy at being ignored, and they broke apart laughing. Cole went back to playing with the baby, while Sarah finished the dishes, and Timothy looked up from his homework and grinned at both of them, like he knew exactly how fortunate they all were. The years passed in a steady rhythm of work and family and love. Timothy grew into a young man, tall and strong, with their father's build and their mother's gentle temperament. When he turned 18, he got a job working as a clerk in a law office in town, showing an aptitude for paperwork and detail that surprised everyone. He still lived with them, not ready yet to strike out on his own, and Sarah was grateful for his continued presence in their household. James grew into a sturdy, adventurous toddler, and then a curious little boy, always getting into things and asking endless questions about how the world worked. When he was 3, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born on a warm summer evening in 1882, a tiny, perfect little girl with Cole's amber eyes and Sarah's dark hair. They named her Emma, after Cole's mother, and if Sarah had thought she could not love another child as much as she loved James, she was proven wrong the moment Emma was placed in her arms. Cole was just as besotted with his daughter as he had been with his son, and James was thrilled to be a big brother, taking his new responsibilities very seriously. With 2 children to care for, money was tighter than it had been, and Sarah sometimes worried about how they would manage. But Cole always seemed to find a way to make ends meet, taking on extra work when it was available, and Sarah resumed her mending business once Emma was old enough to be left for short periods, working while the children napped or played together. Timothy helped out financially when he could, insisting on paying rent even though Sarah told him it was not necessary. And gradually they built up a small savings that gave them a cushion against emergencies. The house that had seemed so spacious when they first moved in now felt cramped with 4 adults and 2 children, but they made it work, and Sarah tried to be grateful for what they had rather than focusing on what they lacked. When Emma was 2 years old, Cole came home one evening looking tired but excited. He sat down at the dinner table and waited until everyone was assembled before making his announcement. "I have been offered a job," he said, looking around at all of them. "Managing a small ranch about 10 miles outside of town. The owner is getting too old to handle the day-to-day operations himself, and he needs someone reliable to oversee things. The pay is better than what I make at the stockyards, and there is a house on the property that comes with the job, bigger than this one, with room for all of us." Sarah felt her heart leap with hope and excitement. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "But what would I do? Would I be able to continue my mending work?" "You could if you wanted to," Cole said, "but you would not have to. The pay would be enough that you could focus on the children and the household if that is what you prefer. Or you could still take in work. It is up to you." Sarah looked at Timothy, who was grinning broadly. "That is great news, Cole," Timothy said. "You would be perfect for that kind of job. You know everything there is to know about ranching." "What about you?" Sarah asked Timothy. "Would you come with us, or would you stay in town to be closer to your job?" Timothy hesitated, and Sarah could see him thinking through the options. "I would come with you," he finally said. "At least for a while. I like my job, but I could find something similar in whatever town is nearest to the ranch. And I want to help with the move and make sure you are all settled before I think about finding my own place." So they made the decision to take the job, and a month later they moved to the ranch, loading all their possessions onto a borrowed wagon and making the 10-mile journey in the late spring sunshine. The ranch was called the Double Bar, and it was a modest operation with about 500 head of cattle and a dozen horses, plus the usual chickens and pigs and other livestock that any working ranch required. The house was indeed bigger than their place in town, a sprawling wooden structure with 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen with a big stove, a sitting room, and even a separate dining room. There was a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides of the house, offering views of the surrounding prairie and the distant line of cottonwoods that marked where a creek ran through the property. Sarah fell in love with it immediately, already imagining how she would arrange their furniture and what curtains she would make for the windows. Cole thrived in his new position, and it quickly became clear that he had a real talent for managing people and resources. the handful of ranch hands who worked the double bar respected him, and the owner, an elderly man named Mr. Blackwell, was so pleased with Cole's work that he started talking about eventually selling Cole the ranch when he was ready to retire completely. "I do not have any children to leave it to, Mr." Blackwell told Cole one day when Sarah was within earshot, "and I like the idea of the place going to someone who will care for it the way I have, who will treat it as more than just a business. You think about it, Thornton. We can work out a payment plan that would allow you to buy me out over time." That night, Cole and Sarah stayed up late, talking about the possibility of actually owning the ranch someday, of having something permanent and substantial to pass on to their children. It seemed like an impossible dream, but Mr. Blackwell was serious about his offer, and over the next few years they worked out an arrangement where a portion of Cole's pay went toward purchasing the property. Life on the ranch was different from life in town, but Sarah adapted quickly and found that she actually preferred the relative isolation and the closer connection to the land. She planted a garden and tended chickens and learned how to do 100 small tasks that ranch life required. The children thrived in the wide open spaces, with James in particular showing an early interest in the cattle and horses, following Cole around whenever he was allowed and begging to be taught how to ride. Timothy stayed with them for another year before he met a young woman in the nearby town of Kinsley, a schoolteacher named Margaret, who shared his love of books and learning. They courted for 6 months before Timothy asked her to marry him, and Sarah gave them her blessing with tears of joy in her eyes, so happy to see her little brother grown up and starting his own family. Timothy and Margaret married in the fall of 1884, in the same small church where Sarah and Cole had been married years before. After the wedding, they moved to a small house in Kinsley, close to the school where Margaret taught, and Timothy found work as a clerk in the town bank. They visited the ranch regularly, and Sarah loved seeing Timothy so happy and settled, knowing that all her years of sacrifice and hard work to keep him safe and healthy had paid off in the best possible way. By 1885, Sarah and Cole officially owned the Double Bar Ranch, having made the final payment to Mr. Blackwell, who moved to live with a niece in Wichita and left them in complete control of the property. It was a moment of triumph and pride, standing in the yard of their ranch and knowing that it was truly theirs, that they had built something solid and lasting that they could pass on to James and Emma and any other children they might have. As it turned out, there would be one more child, a surprise pregnancy when Sarah was 32 years old and had assumed she was done having babies. Their second son was born in the spring of 1886, a healthy, red-faced baby boy they named Samuel after Cole's father. James, now 7 years old, and Emma, now 4, were both fascinated by their new baby brother, and they took turns helping Sarah care for him. Cole was 40 years old by this time, his dark hair starting to show threads of silver at the temples, but he was still strong and capable, and he approached fatherhood for the 3rd time with the same joy and wonder he had shown with their first child. Watching him with Samuel, Sarah thought about how far they had both come from that day in Henderson's general store when she had been bartering her mother's ring for medicine, and Cole had been a drifting cowboy with no permanent home or family. That ring still sat on her finger, a daily reminder of the kindness that had changed both their lives. She thought about it sometimes, about the chain of events that single act of generosity had set in motion, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had built together. One evening when Samuel was about 6 months old, Sarah and Cole sat on the porch after the children were in bed, watching the sun set over the prairie in streaks of orange and gold and purple. Cole had his arm around Sarah's shoulders, and she was leaning against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the steady beat of his heart. "What are you thinking about?" Cole asked, the same question he had asked her so many times over the years. "I was thinking about that first day we met," Sarah said. "How I was so desperate and scared, and how you appeared like some kind of answer to a prayer I had not even known how to pray." Cole tightened his arm around her. "I remember seeing you in that store, crying over that ring, and feeling like I had been hit in the chest. I knew right then that you were going to be important to me, even though I did not understand how or why." "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, a question that had occasionally nagged at her over the years. "Giving up the freedom of your cowboy life to settle down with a ready-made family and all the responsibilities that came with it?" Cole turned to look at her, his amber eyes serious and intent. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for one single moment. That life was empty, Sarah. I did not realize how empty until I had something real to compare it to. You and the children, this ranch, the life we have built together, That is everything I never knew I wanted and did not believe I could have. You gave me purpose and meaning and love, and I would choose you over and over again without hesitation." Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes, happy tears that seemed to come more easily these days. "I love you so much," she said, "more than I think I can ever properly express." "You express it every day," Cole said, kissing her forehead gently. "In the way you care for our children, in the way you have built a home for us, in the way you look at me like I am something precious. I feel loved, Sarah. Every single day I feel loved, and that is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over them since the beginning of their story. Sarah thought about the future, about watching James and Emma and Samuel grow up, about maybe someday having grandchildren running around the ranch, about growing old with Cole by her side. It was a good future, full of promise and possibility, built on a foundation of love and kindness and sacrifice. And it had all started because a cowboy with a kind heart had seen a woman in need and decided to help her. Not because he expected anything in return, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Sarah twisted the ring on her finger, feeling the familiar weight of it, and sent up a silent prayer of thanks to her mother, who had given her this ring and unknowingly set in motion the events that had led to her happiness. Then she settled more comfortably against Cole's side and let herself simply be in the moment, grateful for every precious second of the life they were living together. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. James grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as Cole did, and it was clear from an early age that he would take over the operation someday. Emma was bright and curious, loving books and learning, and Sarah made sure she had access to as much education as they could provide, even hiring a tutor to come out to the ranch twice a week to give her lessons. Samuel was the youngest, and in many ways the wildest, always getting into scrapes and coming home with torn clothes and scraped knees, but with such a sunny disposition that it was impossible to stay angry with him for long. Timothy and Margaret had children of their own, 2 daughters who were close in age to Samuel, and the cousins grew up visiting back and forth between the ranch and Kinsley, forming bonds that Sarah hoped would last their whole lives. Mr. Blackwell passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1888, and Sarah and Cole attended his funeral, grateful for the opportunity he had given them and the faith he had shown in their abilities. By the time Sarah turned 40 in 1893, she looked around at her life and felt nothing but deep satisfaction and contentment. She had 3 healthy children, a husband she loved more with each passing year, a home that was comfortable and welcoming, and enough financial security that she did not have to worry about where their next meal was coming from or how they would pay for medicine if someone got sick. She thought sometimes about that desperate girl she had been at 21, clutching her mother's ring and trying to barter it for medicine to save her dying brother, and she could barely recognize herself in that memory. That girl had been so scared and alone, carrying the weight of the world on her narrow shoulders with no one to help her bear the burden. This woman, the one she had become, was confident and capable, secure in the knowledge that she had a partner who would stand beside her through anything. Cole at 48 still worked the ranch every day, though he had hired more hands over the years to help with the heavy labor. He was teaching James everything he knew about managing livestock and land, and Sarah could see that it would not be many more years before James was capable of running the place himself. Emma, at 15, was talking about maybe becoming a teacher like her Aunt Margaret, and Sarah was encouraging her to pursue that dream, wanting her daughter to have opportunities that she herself had never had. Samuel, at 11, was still deciding what he wanted to be when he grew up, his interests ranging from cowboy to train engineer to shopkeeper, depending on the day of the week. Sarah and Cole just smiled and told him he had plenty of time to figure it out. On their 20th wedding anniversary in the summer of 1899, Cole surprised Sarah with a trip to Denver, arranging for Margaret and Timothy to come stay at the ranch and watch the children so they could have a week to themselves. Sarah had never been to a big city before, and she was both nervous and excited as they boarded the train in Kinsley and headed west into the mountains. Denver was overwhelming, with its tall buildings and crowded streets and electric lights that turned night into day. But it was also exciting and beautiful. Cole had booked them a room in a nice hotel, and they spent their days exploring the city, visiting museums and restaurants and shops. acting like newlyweds even though they had been married for 2 decades and had 3 children back home. On their last night in Denver, Cole took Sarah to a fancy restaurant where they sat at a table with a white cloth and used more forks than Sarah had ever seen in one place. After they had finished their meal, Cole reached across the table and took Sarah's hand, the one that still wore her mother's ring, alongside the simple gold wedding band he had given her. 20 years, he said, running his thumb over the rings. 20 years since you walked into my life and changed everything. 20 years since you gave me back my mother's ring and my hope for the future, Sarah countered, smiling at him across the candlelit table. I have been thinking about that day a lot lately, Cole admitted, about how close we came to never meeting, about all the little choices and coincidences that had to align perfectly for us to end up in that store at that exact moment. If I had left town a day earlier, or if you had gone to a different doctor, or if Doc Henderson had been less honest about telling me your story, we might never have met. But we did meet, Sarah said firmly, and we built this beautiful life together. That is what matters. Cole nodded slowly. You are right, but I just wanted you to know, on our anniversary, that I do not take any of it for granted. Not one single day of the life we have together. You are still the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Thornton, and I am still grateful every single day that you said yes when I asked you to marry me. Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears, moved by the depth of emotion in his voice even after all these years together. And you are the best thing that ever happened to me, she said. You saved me, Cole. You saved Timothy. You gave me a family and a home and a life worth living. I can never thank you enough for that. You do not have to thank me, Cole said. Loving you has been the easiest and most natural thing I have ever done. They held hands across the table, oblivious to the other diners around them, lost in the moment and in each other. Later that night, back in their hotel room, they made love with the tenderness and familiarity of two people who knew each other's bodies as well as they knew their own. And Sarah fell asleep in Cole's arms, feeling like the luckiest woman in the entire world. When they returned to the ranch, they were greeted with enthusiasm by their children, who had missed them even though it had only been a week. Samuel in particular had been worried they would not come back, and he clung to Sarah for the rest of the day, following her from room to reassure himself that she was really home. Sarah held him and comforted him, and made a mental note not to leave for that long again until the children were older. Life settled back into its familiar rhythms, and the years continued their steady march forward. James turned 21 and started courting a girl from town, a rancher's daughter named Catherine, who shared his love of horses and cattle. Sarah watched the courtship with interest and approval, seeing echoes of her own relationship with Cole in the way James and Catherine looked at each other. They married in the spring of 1902, and Sarah gained a daughter-in-law who fit seamlessly into the family. James and Catherine moved into a small house on the ranch property, close enough to the main house that they could easily work together, but far enough away to have their own privacy and independence. A year after their wedding, they announced they were expecting their first child, and Sarah realized with a sense of wonder that she was going to be a grandmother. The baby, a girl they named Sarah after her grandmother, was born in the winter of 1903, and Sarah held her namesake in her arms and felt the circle of life continuing, generation following generation. Cole was equally besotted with his granddaughter, and it was common to see him walking around the ranch with the baby in his arms, pointing out horses and cows and explaining everything to her, even though she was too young to understand a word of it. Emma graduated from a teaching program in Kansas City and returned to teach at the small school in Kinsley, following in her Aunt Margaret's footsteps. She boarded with Timothy and Margaret during the school year and came home to the ranch on weekends and during summer vacation, filling the house with stories about her students and the challenges and joys of teaching. Samuel at 17 was working the ranch full-time alongside Cole and James, and he had finally settled on following in his father's footsteps and making his life as a cattleman. He had inherited Cole's natural way with animals and Sarah's steady calm in a crisis, and Sarah knew he would be fine wherever life took him. By the time Sarah turned 50 in 1903, she had 6 grandchildren, with James and Catherine having added 2 sons to their daughter, Timothy and Margaret's daughters, both married and starting families of their own, and Emma engaged to a nice young man who taught at a school in Dodge City. The ranch was prospering under the combined management of Cole, James, and Samuel, and Sarah was able to spend most of her time doing things she enjoyed, rather than endless hard labor just to survive. She had started keeping a journal a few years earlier, writing down her memories and thoughts, wanting to preserve the story of her life for her children and grandchildren to read someday. As she wrote about her past, about those desperate years after her parents died, about the day she met Cole, about the building of their family and their life together, she was struck again and again by how much had changed and how much it all traced back to that single moment of kindness in Henderson's general store. One evening she read some of her writing aloud to Cole, who listened with the same focused attention he always gave her. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You should tell that story to the grandchildren," he said, "about the ring and how we met. I think it is important for them to know that small acts of kindness can change lives, that doing the right thing even when it is hard or inconvenient can have ripples that spread far beyond what we can see in the moment." So Sarah started telling the story to her grandchildren, gathering them around when they came to visit and recounting how their grandfather had bought back a ring and given it to a stranger without asking for anything in return, and how that act of generosity had led to everything they now knew as their family. The children listened with wide eyes, fascinated by the idea of their grandmother as a desperate young woman and their grandfather as a wandering cowboy. And Sarah hoped that they were learning the lesson Cole wanted them to learn, that kindness mattered and that how you treated people had consequences that could last for generations. Cole's hair was completely white by the time he turned 60 in 1911, and he had slowed down considerably from the vigorous man Sarah had married. He still worked the ranch, but he left more and more of the day-to-day operations to James and Samuel, content to consult and advise rather than doing the hard physical labor himself. Sarah, at 58, felt her own age in her aching joints and the way she tired more easily. But she was still active and engaged with life, spending her days cooking and cleaning and tending her garden and visiting with her ever-growing collection of grandchildren. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by 3 generations of family, with a huge party at the ranch that drew people from all over the county. Sarah wore her best dress, and Cole wore a suit that made him look distinguished and handsome, and they danced together under the stars while their children and grandchildren clapped and cheered. As they swayed to the music, Sarah looked up at Cole's face, lined now with age, but still the face she loved more than any other, and she thought about the miracle of their life together. 40 years, she said, echoing his words from their 20th anniversary. "Who would have thought?" "I would have," Cole said firmly. "From the moment I saw you in that store, some part of me knew you were going to be mine for the rest of my life." "We have been very blessed," Sarah said, looking around at all the people gathered to celebrate with them, all the lives they had touched and who had touched theirs in return. "We have," Cole agreed, "and it is not over yet. We still have years ahead of us, God willing." He was right. They had another decade together, years that were quieter and slower than the busy middle years of their life, but no less precious. They watched their grandchildren grow up and start having children of their own, making them great-grandparents multiple times over. They saw changes come to the world around them, automobiles replacing horses on many roads, electricity and telephone lines spreading across the countryside, airplanes taking to the skies. The world was transforming in ways they could never have imagined when they first met, but through it all, their love remained constant and unchanging. Cole passed away in his sleep on a cold January night in 1921, at the age of 70. Sarah woke up beside him and knew immediately that he was gone, and she lay there for a long time, holding his hand and saying goodbye to the man who had been her partner and lover and best friend for more than 40 years. When she finally got up and told the family, the grief that swept through the ranch was profound and genuine, because Cole had been loved by everyone who knew him, and his loss left a hole that could never be filled. They buried him in the small cemetery on the edge of the ranch property, under a big cottonwood tree, with a view of the prairie he had loved. Sarah stood at the graveside surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, 3 generations of family that existed because Cole Thornton had once seen a woman in need and decided to help her. As the minister read the prayers and the coffin was lowered into the ground, Sarah twisted the ring on her finger, the ring that had started it all, and she made a silent promise to Cole that she would keep living, keep loving, keep being present for their family until the day came when she could join him. She lived for another 5 years, staying active and engaged right up until the end, still telling stories to any grandchild or great-grandchild who would listen, still keeping her journal, still tending her garden, and visiting with friends and family. The ring never left her finger, and she made arrangements before her death that it should be passed to Emma, her only daughter, to keep in the family for future generations. Sarah died peacefully in her sleep on a warm summer night in 1926 at the age of 73, and they buried her next to Cole under the cottonwood tree. At her funeral, which was attended by so many people they overflowed the small church and had to stand outside, Emma told the story one more time. The story of how a desperate young woman had tried to barter her mother's ring for medicine to save her brother's life, and how a kind cowboy had bought it back and given her both items, and how that act of generosity had led to everything they were celebrating that day, the life and love and legacy of Sarah Mitchell Thornton. Emma wore the ring for the rest of her own life, and she passed it on to her own daughter, who passed it on to hers, and the story was told again and again down through the years, a reminder that kindness matters, that small acts of generosity can have consequences far beyond what we can imagine, and that love built on a foundation of compassion and selflessness can last not just for a lifetime, but for generations. The Double Bar Ranch continued to operate under the management of James's descendants, and more than 100 years after Cole and Sarah had first owned it, the ranch was still there, still thriving, still telling the story of the cowboy and the ring and the love that had started it all. And in a glass case in the ranch house, carefully preserved, sat a simple gold ring with a small sapphire, the ring that had changed everything, the ring that had brought together two people who were meant to find each other and build a life that would echo down through the ages. The story of Sarah and Cole became a family legend, told to every new generation, a testament to the power of kindness and the enduring nature of true love. And every person who heard the story and saw the ring understood on some fundamental level that they were part of something bigger than themselves, part of a legacy that had started with a single act of generosity in a dusty Kansas town in the summer of 1878, and that would continue as long as there were people who believed in doing the right thing simply because it was right, and in loving deeply and completely without reservation or regret.